A recent UNC study showed that 88% of US adults are metabolically unhealthy based on 5 risk factors. Now, these 5 risk factors are driven by insulin resistance. So, in this episode, I'm going to talk about the relationship between insulin and glucagon and how insulin resistance drives disease and give you an idea of how you can reverse it. And I'm going to give you a quick hint. It starts with an F. Hey, in this episode, I want to talk about how fasting works to reverse the effects of insulin resistance or the state of insulin resistance. And it's primarily related to the relationship between insulin and glucagon. If you're not familiar with glucagon, that's okay. A lot of people aren't. But those two work in opposition to each other most of the time, as they should. But in the last episode, if you heard that, I mentioned a UNC study that found that only 12% of US adults are metabolically healthy based on 5 health markers, 5 criteria that are considered risk factors for heart disease. And each of those criteria, risk factors, are actually driven by insulin sensitivity or really insulin resistance. So the lack of insulin sensitivity. So the higher your insulin resistance, the more likely you are to have one or more of those risk factors. And basically insulin resistance, if you're not familiar with that, it's basically your body can't effectively clear sugar from the blood. So insulin is not getting the response it needs from the cells where it takes the muscle cells and sometimes even the fat cells where it's taking that energy, that blood sugar or the protein. Insulin, the purpose of insulin is to take, we can't sustain health in a healthy state, sustain elevated blood sugar for a long period of time. We're not supposed to. That's essentially type 2 diabetes. But we don't want blood sugar just floating through our veins all the time after we eat. So insulin moves glucose as well as proteins into cells, and it moves the glucose into muscle cells for energy, for be stored as glycogen into the liver. It moves proteins into cells, or amino acids really into cells to be converted into proteins. So we build proteins through insulin functions to the insulin receptors. And at some point, the insulin receptor says, "Nope, not taking anymore. We're done," or we're not responding anymore. The response just isn't there. And so what happens is blood sugar builds up and stays in the system, and it can often be for a while stored as fat is usually what happens for a long time. But then what happens is you have that even when the fat cells kind of hit their maximum storage, they become inflamed and start spilling out fat. And that starts heading, then the fat goes to the visceral area. So the area under the muscle, around the waist, okay, where your organs are stored, that space where your organs are, starts filling up with fat, not just space, but the organs themselves. So, and the early symptoms of this elevated blood sugar, insulin resistance really are, besides the gaining of visceral fat, which causes the waist circumference to expand, obviously, which is one of the risk factors, but you get high blood pressure, high blood sugar, obviously by definition, high triglycerides and low HDL. And the associated lifestyle diseases that accompany that, typically down the road, after the insulin resistance has been in place, could be, varies from person to person what they get first or what they end up getting. But it could, type 2 diabetes, obviously, heart disease, stroke, forms of dementia, different forms of cancer, all related to high blood sugar, insulin resistance, where blood sugars are not controlled. It's normal to be high right after a meal, but then 2 to 4 hours later, insulin comes back down because blood sugar has been brought back to normal. But when that's not the case and blood sugar remains high extensively, we get these diseases. We get inflammation, we get higher risk of disease. We get growth of cells that we don't want growing. So when it's elevated frequently, as I mentioned, insulin becomes less effective at taking that blood sugar away And as far as the fat cells reaching their maximum, that can vary from person to person or even genotype. So what we see is some people are really good at storing fat. Now, it doesn't sound like a good thing, but they can just put on a lot of fat under the skin, subcutaneous fat around the body, all the stuff we're trying to lose to look good in our genes, right? Um, that's actually protecting us from the fat going to the visceral area. Now, there's certain uh, groups, genotypes, usually Asians or people in the Middle East sometimes. Um, it depends. Tend to have less tolerance of subcutaneous fat storage. In other words, their fat cells reach a maximum sooner than someone from, say, who has a genotype from, say, Northern Europe. And so some from Northern Europe can probably get really fat before the fat really starts hitting its maximum. The fat cells meet their maximum and starts dumping fat towards the visceral area, and they start developing metabolic disease. As more fat gets in the visceral area around those organs, it affects the function of those organs, and then we start developing metabolic disease. Like I just mentioned, the excessive insulin resistance. That can happen sooner in different. So mostly India, people from India, Asia, that side of the world tend to have a genetic makeup that doesn't allow them to gain much subcutaneous fat. Their fat cells hit their maximum as far as reproduction of more fat cells, or hit their maximum storage sooner, and the fat starts being stored in the visceral area sooner, and then they develop metabolic disease like type 2 diabetes or the excessive insulin resistance, without having gained a great deal of fat weight, like someone from Northern Europe might. So while, say, obesity rates in China or Japan or India may be much lower than those in the United States, their diabetes rates are actually climbing much more quickly, and catching up to ours. So they're more likely to develop diabetes sooner without having to gain the excess weight. We're all just a little different, that's how it is. But the same effect is created by the same things, created by the excess, usually sugar and frequent eating, snacking, eating too often, elevating the insulin way too often. Because this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, related to the relationship between insulin and glucagon. If you don't know about glucagon, it's insulin's less popular sidekick. So basically, both are created in the pancreas. The beta cells create insulin, but if we have beta cells, that means we had to probably had some alpha cells, alpha then beta, right? So alpha cells produce glucagon. Okay, and while insulin is a storage hormone that gets elevated, like as I mentioned, when we take in fuel, helps us store that fuel, whether we store it as fat, store sugar in the muscles, as glycogen, stored in the liver. We're not supposed to burn fat, okay, or release more fuel, stored fat, stored glycogen, while we're in the process of storing. We're trying to eliminate fuel from our bloodstream and put it somewhere we can use it for later, because muscles are probably already full pretty quickly. We're not going to use it right now unless you're literally running while you're taking it in. But you're trying to store it. So if you're storing, you're not going to release stored fuel at the same time. Wouldn't make sense, at least not in a healthy environment. That's what we're going to get to. So the release of, so when insulin's low and we don't have stored fuel or recently eaten fuel in our bloodstream, we want to release stored fuel. So fat burning, fat being converted to ketones, the release of liver glycogen, or even gluconeogenesis, where if liver glycogen is getting low, we start converting protein or muscle into glycogen to use for blood sugar to keep everything level. And that's normal. It's like in the fasted state, considering that it takes 2 to 4 hours for blood sugar to come down after we eat, for insulin to come back to normal levels. It needs to be usually 3-4 hours after you've eaten before that can even begin, if not more, depending on what was eaten and the level of insulin resistance. But those kind of that kind of activity, the ketone production, the glycogen release to level out, keep blood sugar levels normal levels, not spikes, normal levels when we aren't eating, that's driven by glucagon. Now, cortisol can actually do that as well under a stressful situation like a workout. You're just panicking, whatever, freaking out, stress. Cortisol can do those things. So I'm not saying glucagon is the only thing that does that, but that is glucagon's role in relation to fasting and feeding. Okay, insulin low, the glucagon comes up. When insulin goes up, glucagon's supposed to come down to regulate these activities. So we're not storing and releasing at the same time. We're not breaking down fuel and storing fuel at the same time. It's just not supposed to work that way. So since insulin can remain elevated for 3 or 4 hours after a meal, frequent eating, so if you're eating all the time, like say you're snacking and eating every 3 or 4 hours, you're not going to get much glucagon activity. You're not going to break down stored fat or release much liver glycogen. You're just going to keep storing. You're going to be storing all the time because your blood sugar is just doing this. You're stimulating hunger. Insulin's high. You're not going to break much down. I've said that many times before in other podcasts. But when insulin resistance is progressed and we start having the visceral fat building up, okay, the fat that goes to that space affects the liver. So that's going to affect insulin resistance and make it worse. It also can get into the pancreas and get in any of the organs and affect function of any of those organs. But talking about the pancreas right now with insulin and glucagon, the hormonal signaling between insulin and glucagon gets impaired, whether it's by fat in the pancreas, which is enabling or causing dysfunction of the glucagon to read the hormonal signals, or from insulin being elevated so often that it just doesn't give off signals well. It's losing a certain, there's some change to the insulin that makes it less effective. That could be, there's one or more factors there that can relate to the impaired signaling. But the point is, insulin and glucagon just aren't able to communicate like they're supposed to. So when insulin goes up, glucagon doesn't get the signal and it may not come back down. So the problem, do you see the problem there? If the blood sugar is high and insulin is storing, insulin's trying to like either store it in muscles or store it in fat cells, create new fat cells, store the fat away, and even to the point that it's going back to the visceral area for the liver restored. But then glucagon doesn't get the signal to shut off, and it keeps trying to release sugar from the liver and break down proteins or muscle to create more sugar, or trying to release ketones, then we have a problem, because the blood sugar is perpetuated. The high blood sugar is perpetuated. Insulin's trying to move it, trying to lower levels in the bloodstream. But even though you're not eating, your body's still releasing it like you're fasting. And insulin, generally speaking, in this state is not as effective at getting rid of it, right? Because some of the cells are resistant. So the blood sugar is already high because insulin's not able to do its job as well. The cells aren't responsive to it. Then we have glucagon continuing to spit this stuff out. So we've got this vicious cycle that not only creates inflammation and disease, but you're also probably creating hunger, you're breaking down muscle, and you're storing fat. So you have muscle breaking down to create sugar. The insulin stores the sugar as fat if it can. If it's not in the subcutaneous fat, it goes back to the visceral fat. As more and more of that sugar and the fat goes back to the liver, it's pumping out more triglycerides. So we have all the risk factors that we've talked about for metabolic disease, or the unhealthy metabolic 5 risk factors, with gaining waist circumference, right? Because the visceral fat's being stored. The elevated blood pressure is caused by the elevated insulin levels, and then possibly fat in the kidneys causing the kidney disease, but all that causing high blood pressure. Blood sugar is part of it. It's the problem. It's the driver of it. And then we have high triglycerides, because the liver's trying to figure out what to do with all this fuel that's coming at it, whether it's some overloaded subcutaneous fat cells or the extra blood sugar. Meanwhile, glucagon's telling it to pump more blood sugar out, and it's pumping out more triglycerides for energy as well. It's sending fat out. That's how we send out fat, through triglycerides for fuel. When you're fasting, your triglycerides will go up to provide fat. That's what triglyceride is a fat molecule taken by an LDL particle and delivered to muscles for fuel. Or in this case, just to be stored away as fat somewhere else, probably in the visceral area, in another organ, in your heart, in your kidneys, or maybe more in the pancreas. Because the liver's like, no more, I've got no room for more fat or more sugar. So you've got this fat creating, muscle burning, blood sugar driven cycle of disease, creating disease. Because there's the impaired signaling from the blood sugar and the excessive fat spilling out from subcutaneous cells into the visceral area. Sounds awful, doesn't it? And yet, apparently, according to the study, about 88% of the US adults are somewhere along that track. They have those risk factors. They have one of those risk factors is because more than likely, this is what's happening to some degree. There's some level on that pathway of insulin resistance. So how do we stop it, right? If you're not asking that now, I'm not sure what to tell you. But if you're not asking, how do you stop it? How do you stop the cycle? How do I cut it short? How do I cut it short before I become diseased? Or how do I reverse these diseases? Essentially, you have to stop eating. There is no magic food. There is no magic pill. There's no medication for this that really reverses the process and brings metabolic health, hormonal balance back to your body, that reduces the fat in the visceral area, in the organs, better than, or even nearly as effective as not eating, as also known as fasting. Yes, the F word for many of you. But we have to at least stop eating as frequently. Okay. Allow the fat cells, for instance, the subcutaneous fat cells to empty, to reduce, come back to healthy levels so they're not spilling out toward the visceral area. Let them get healthy again. And also allow that visceral fat to be used for energy, the fat that's around the organs, around the liver and in the pancreas, to get burned up, to be used. Because once there's a need, get a need or a deficit, not a calorie deficit necessarily. There's a calorie deficit, but you have to let insulin levels come back down and blood sugar levels come back down. And the signaling to improve for that fat to be burned, you've got to create a need. And as long as you're eating, whatever you're eating, I mean, protein elevates insulin. If you're eating fat, if you're just eating pure lard, that's still going to be stored in your subcutaneous fat. It doesn't even go through the liver. It goes straight from your gut, the portal vein, delivered to fat cells. So there's no other way to reduce insulin or have fewer frequent spikes of insulin than to just stop eating, not eat as often. Sounds scary to some of you? Hey, start here. Here's baby steps. Now, ideally, you want to try to work towards some kind of intermittent fasting, if not longer, but 16 to 18 hour fast could be enough, depending on where you are in the spectrum of insulin resistance, to make that work, along with a low carb diet. 16, 18 hour fast, a low carb diet. Recommended, I would eat high protein rather than necessarily adding more fat. I know fat doesn't stimulate insulin like protein does. However, as I mentioned before, you store fat as soon as you eat it. And the problem is those fat cells are spilling out and it's only going to the visceral area. So protein is going to be a little more satisfying and give you what you need to maintain muscle, maintain lean mass and bone, and lots of nutrients. There's more nutrients in, I'm not saying a super lean, I'm saying you have to eat boneless, skinless chicken breast or like nasty canned tuna with no fat in it. No fat, some meat with some fat in it. It's great, healthy. But definitely cut back on carbs, very low carb, low sugar or non-existent sugar, no processed food. Focus on protein But the idea of skipping a meal is scary to you right now. I understand. It's because hormonally, your body's like elevated blood sugar. It's that whole cycle I just went through. It's going to stimulate your hunger. You're feeling hunger, and it's legitimate, not because you don't have enough fuel to burn, but because hormonally, that's the signal you're getting. That's driving your behavior. You're on a cycle, and you've got to stop the cycle somehow. So, is that going to be easy? No, there's no magic pill. But you've got to stop. The only way to stop the cycle is to stop eating as frequently. So start with, if you have to, 3 meals a day. And for some of you, that's a big deal to just have a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner with, 3 or 4 hours between each one, and then eat nothing for like at least 12 hours between dinner and breakfast. For some of you, that might be a big step. Start there for at least, a couple of weeks till that gets easy, till things calm down enough and you're eating higher protein meals 3 times a week, breakfast, lunch, dinner, 12-hour fast between dinner and breakfast. Great start. You're going to see some improvement there. You're going to see some weight loss, things calming down, and eventually you won't have the cravings. You won't miss those extra meals, but that's where you start. Then my recommendation, keep your dinner, maybe keep your lunch, skip your breakfast, maybe with some coffee, no sugar, but try to compress your meals into an 8-hour period, or even a 6-hour period if you can, where you're eating 2 meals a day, lunch and dinner, and they're maybe 6 or 8 hours apart, tops. Again, sticking low carb, higher protein, and just the natural fat that goes along with that protein. Okay, not mounds of butter and lard on top of that. Okay, but until you get things settled, go with that. You're going to be more satisfied by that. You're going to have less hunger signaling. So allowing the blood sugar to come down, and then insulin levels come down, so that you can actually burn fat effectively without replacing it constantly. Like you're not just burning it, releasing it, like we mentioned with glucagon is, and then immediately storing it, but you can actually use it for energy. You That's going to bring down your hunger. It's going to bring down your cravings. Allow some signaling between ghrelin and leptin, which are your hunger and satiety hormones, to come back into balance. And once that happens, so let it happen. Shake it a week at a time. Go 2 weeks, maybe 3 meals a day, or 3 weeks. Then go to skipping breakfast 3 times a week. Do like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You're going to skip breakfast. Try that for 2 or 3 weeks. And then move towards 6 or 7 days a week where you're skipping breakfast, you're eating 2 meals a day, and you're compressed into a 16 or 18-hour window. Again, eating whole food, avoiding the processed food, whole protein heavy, naturally occurring fats, with some veggies on the side if you want that, if you're tolerant of that. But your primary meal should be around the animal protein. And then once you get that down, you've got 6 or 7 days of intermittent fasting, it's good. You've got a few weeks, not a big deal. I'm going to challenge you. This is what I do just as a maintenance. Okay, so once or twice a week, do a dinner to dinner fast. In other words, you have dinner on Monday night, and you don't eat again until dinner on Tuesday night. Okay, so it's like a 24-hour fast, we call it that. But you're sleeping for the first half of it. Really, it's nighttime. You're relaxing, go to bed. So you get through one day till dinner without eating. Now, again, if this sounds scary to you right now, I'm not saying do it tomorrow. I'm saying start with 3 meals a day, then try skipping breakfast after a couple of weeks, get that down. Then this will be much easier. You've already done 16 or 18 hours fasted. Another 24 is not much more. Once or twice a week. Start with once, see how that works. The point is to regain insulin signaling and get your weight back down where it needs to be. And then you'll find what you need for maintenance. But to really turn this ship around, to really effectively, quickly, reduce visceral fat, reduce the fat in the organs so that organ function is regained, inflammation comes down, you have improved hormonal signaling, you're going to have to do a little more than you would just to maintain your weight. You have to put out more effort. You're going to have to do a little extra. But I think you'll find that once you get used to that, the intermittent fasting will become very natural for you and you'll feel better on it. Most people do. Most people feel better. They feel less bloated, less heavy. Their energy levels they're much more steady. Believe it or not, you have more energy because it's not up and down all the time. Liver can maintain blood sugar, nice steady level, okay, between meals. That's its job. We're not supposed to eat to maintain blood sugar. Our liver maintains blood sugar. We eat to for to refuel, yes, and to give us nutrients and to give us protein for the structure, to maintain structure, because we lose protein every day. And if you're active and you're exercising, even more so. So now, this is not something I made up. People have been using fasting to reverse even type 2 diabetes, something as metabolic disease to the point of type 2 diabetes for over a decade. Jason Fung and Megan Ramos have what's called the fasting method. They've been reversing type 2 diabetes for a decade with thousands of patients reversing type 2 diabetes. Now, if you're type 2 diabetic and you're insulin dependent or you're taking medications to control your blood sugar of any kind, get medical supervision. Let someone know what's going on so they can help you with how to regulate those medications, because you don't want to take enough insulin like you're eating like you normally do, for instance, and then start fasting, your blood sugar is going to fall through the floor. So you got to know how to regulate your blood sugar meds along with the fasting. But over time, the goal is to come off those meds. I mean, Dr. Kristen Bauer, I had on my podcast along with Megan a few weeks before that, they're reversing type 2 diabetes where people are coming off their meds in 6 weeks. So imagine if you are type 2 diabetic, yes, get some help with it, but your goal is to come off those medications. You no longer need them. I don't know another plan that would do that. You've got to use diet and lifestyle to come off those meds. But for those of you who are not type 2 diabetic and you just see this happening, you see these risk factors happening, we have high triglycerides or high blood pressure, or your waist is getting thicker, and you notice your energy levels are up and down, and your blood sugar is off. Start now. Don't wait until you're on medications to take control of this. Start with intermittent fasting. It's probably enough to reverse what you have going on right now. 16 hours. Start with the 3 meals a day. That's good. 2 meals, 8 hours apart, lunch and dinner. You're going to be very happy with the results. But as far as I know, it's the most effective way to do this. There is no magic food. There are foods that, as I mentioned, sugar, processed foods that aggravate it, will make it worse. But there's no food that causes you to burn fat. What causes you to burn fat is an absence of food, an absence of needed blood sugar. Okay, when blood sugar levels are normal, then you will regulate that by breaking down fat, turning it into ketones, releasing liver glycogen like you're supposed to. That's the goal. If you have excess fat you want to get rid of, you want to access that, you've got to have insulin levels low. The only way insulin levels get low is to stop eating. Whenever you eat, insulin levels go up. You have to stop eating. So start 3 meals a day, but start your goal, intermittent fasting, and doing it now. I know it's the holidays. Yes, enjoy your Christmas dinner, but not every day is Christmas. Not every day is New Year's Eve. Start now. Don't wait till January.